Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to be talking you through sections of the research methods that are in the first year of the course, and they can be found on page 20 of your green books. Now, a lot of this stuff you will know. It's not like I'm expecting you for it to be completely new, but what will be different is that this will be research methods in terms or in context of psychology. There also may be one or two phrases that might be unfamiliar, but if you kind of systematically go through this, you'll be fine. So the first thing I want to look at is quantitative and qualitative data. Now, of course, I do expect you to know each of these because you might have used them in science, you might have used them in maths, and you need to find a way in which you can express your understanding of each of these things. So, for example, we have qualitative data. This is expressed in words rather than numbers. So whenever we see an expression of a study that is collecting words, maybe an interview, maybe a transcript of a video or interview, then of course it's a written description and as such will be qualitative data. So we see the transcript from an interview or an extract from a diary or notes would be qualitative data. I often view it in my own kind of understanding of it, of the word quality. And so, of course, I can certainly say something and add quality to the description. So we use qualitative data often when we are collecting data that's concerned with, as it says here, interpretation of language and as such, an interview or an unstructured observation is a good example of when we use qualitative data. Now, why would we use it and kind of what is good about it is that we find that qualitative data offers us a richness of detail. If I sit down with somebody and actually ask them questions, if I ask them an open-ended question in which they can express their thoughts and opinions and ideas, then I'm going to get a lot of detail. And so, of course, the the data that I'm collecting is coming from somebody who has developed their thoughts, who's potentially told me about their feelings, or even given an opinion. So, therefore, qualitative data is quite important to psychological research. So, we then say that this type of data has external validity because the researcher is able to get some kind of insight into the person's worldview. However, it's difficult to analyze. And I would probably say a lot of initial research that you might do, my recommendation is to not use qualitative data until you've fully understood how to analyze it. So with qualitative data, we feel that we have to look at patterns and comparisons, and that can be difficult to identify. Because we're looking for patterns, we say that qualitative data has a weakness that it has subjective interpretations, and these themselves may have some element of bias in them and may kind of express the researcher's point of view rather than being objective. So that's why for many psychology students, they will probably focus on quantitative data. So quantitative, we look at the word quantity, that's often to do with numbers, and see we've got a table of numbers there. So very simply, quantitative data is expressed numerically. So if you are looking for scores or you are able to count how many words people recall, then that's going to be quantitative data. Now, of course, we like quantitative data because we can analyze it statistically. We can use tests to help us understand it. We can convert it into graphs in order to help other people understand it. So what excuse me, what you'll find is that what the ways in which we criticized qualitative data, it's going to be the opposite for quantitative data. So we see that it's actually relatively simple to analyze numbers, and we can draw conclusions from that. We also see that numbers tend to be objective and less open to bias. So therefore, that is a reason why we might want to use numbers. However, of course, they fail to represent real life because a number is easy to manipulate. However, it doesn't tell us much about the real world situation. Excuse me. So you might be asking the question, well, which one is best and which one I should do? In my own experience, I would say when you can analyze data, analyze it. When you understand the qualitative nature of what you're doing and you can potentially use techniques to help you with that, then I would do that as well. But of course, there is an overlap between the two. So often a researcher will collect quantitative data, but then also interview the participants in order to get some kind of insight. And so we find that we mostly use both forms of data. We also know that we can take qualitative data and do something called content analysis and convert some of it into numerical data. And we'll do a section of this in year 13. So then the next thing is to move on from the quantitative and qualitative data is to primary and secondary data. Once again, this is something I do expect you to know about. So it says here that primary data refers to original data that has been collected for the specifically for the purpose of the investigation. So in other words, primary data is collected by the researcher or by the researcher's team and is often results in a questionnaire or some kind of analysis being done that comes from the researcher themselves. We often call this first-hand. In other words, the participants' data is what I'm collecting here. So that's primary data. So when I do a questionnaire or I interview somebody or I run some kind of experiment with the participants firsthand, then I've collected primary data. And so, of course, what is good of this is that ultimately it fits the job. So if I'm trying to find out about a class's ability due to a teaching technique and I give them a test, then that's primary data because I've decided that that's the work that I need to do in order to kind of make some kind of understanding or comment on whether my objectives have been met. And so it works. It does what it's meant to do. So what we can say with primary data is that if I need to find something out, then I can actually design something specific for that particular test. And so we do like to use primary data when necessary. However, it takes time and effort to do this. And you find that many of the psychological studies that we might have looked at, that they themselves develop particular scales or questionnaires or ideas that suit their particular purpose. And of course, this takes time and planning and preparation and resources. So therefore, primary data often is not always easily accessible. And so we turn to secondary data. And secondary data is data that pretty much has been collected by somebody other than the person. Now, of course, when I say the person conducting the research, it could be a research team. An example of this is your GCSE data. Even though you set your GCSEs, or previous years you set your GCSEs, or the school submitted actual data for you, and you could say, in terms of the school analysis, that's their primary data. However, the government collects that data and uses it to talk about quality of schools, uses it to kind of maybe express kind of ideas about funding, and that will be secondary data. So we sometimes call this desk research. So for example, I could go on to the DFE, and I could use my computer and sit at a desk, and I can go onto their resources, and I can find out information about this school and other schools. Okay, so in other words, I didn't have to design something specifically for myself. I used somebody else's data. And so that is effectively what secondary data is. So I could go to a journal, an article, or book, or website. I can go to census data that the government might have collected, and all of those types of things are secondary data. So pretty much anything to do with somebody else collecting it is going to be secondary data. So this is similar to the previous example in terms of the evaluation. So this type of data is inexpensive because I didn't have to put all the work into collecting it. And so therefore, it's obviously quite desirable in this particular situation. You also might find that the information already exists and I don't need to reinvent the wheel. In other words, I can just kind of use stuff that is already there, and therefore that ends up being quite important to me. But of course, information is just that. It may not be exactly what I'm looking for. It could be outdated or incomplete because data collection is only as good as the person who's inputted it into a particular database. And so therefore, I may go onto a system, I may find out your GCSE results, but it may not have been updated. Maybe somebody went through an appeal process, or maybe they just kind of inputted it incorrectly. And so therefore, we've got to be wary of secondary data because it could, excuse me, could actually lack some of that information. We also know that the content of the data may not actually match the needs or objectives of our particular study. It may not give me exactly what it is that I'm looking for. So you could find that we use a combination of things, combination of data that we collect as excuse me, as primary data and data that somebody else has collected. So then moving on to something which is potentially new to you. Now, I have mentioned this in my lessons. Often in research support, I say that there's excuse me, a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis basically is research about research. So sometimes people do research and they're fortunate enough to be able to do everything they need to do to publish it. Now, published data doesn't give the raw scores. It tells me about the project and tells me what it is that they found in terms of their results and analysis and conclusions and findings. So what I could do is to find a collection of studies that have studied something similar and then put all of those publications together and analyze that. And that's what meta-analysis is. So what often happens is we have a large number of studies. So I could look for qualitative data in that and kind of look at people's discussions and things that they might have said about the particular outcomes of their projects. Or I could look at some of the tables of data, I could look at their findings and try and find relationships between things. But you can see potentially the value in doing a meta-analysis because other people have done the research. And when we do research, we may not know what other people are doing. So therefore, a meta-analysis is putting together all of those things and trying to understand if there's kind of a relationship between the findings and conclusions. I can use quantitative data, look at size. And so, for example, if I'm doing some research with babies in South Africa, I might be focused simply on the outcomes within my own little study. But there could actually be people in other parts of the world doing something similar. And so meta-analysis tries to pull together those ideas. Now, what is important is we don't get their raw data. What we do is we get their published findings and conclusions, and that is what we analyze, and that's a meta-analysis. So we find that meta-analysis enables us to look at more results over a period of time, and so therefore we can generalize it across a much larger population. Ben Goldacre, in his book Bad Science, refers to meta-analysis and kind of how potentially a small study in a small scale potentially can't see the big picture, but a meta-analysis is able to see a big picture. And apparently they attribute the giving babies vitamin K injections to a meta-analysis that was able to kind of see that if they did this, it would improve kind of infant care. But of course, the biggest problem with all of this is that I'm taking publications. And so we have something called publication bias, which will come up repeatedly through year 12 and year 13. So this analysis is only as good as the things that have been published. Now, typically, publication bias means that they might only publish work from certain groups of people. And typically, that has been males in the past. Or it could be that I only look for significant data. So if something is non-significant, that tells us something. However, it might not be published. So therefore, we find that I'm kind of getting a limited picture of what the outcomes may be. So we say that it's biased because it represents only some relevant data and not all of it. And so therefore, the problem is I could actually draw incorrect conclusions. So there we go. I know that they're short kind of topics. Hopefully you'll be able to fill out everything you need to do in terms of your books. But I thought in order to end with, I'd show you some questions. Now you find that the questions may not necessarily be worth lots of marks. So for example, we have a study here about a concert where somebody throws a bottle onto the stage. Now, if you read through that, we see that the question says, identify one type of data the psychologist collected in this study. Explain your answer. So in other words, it's asking you to think about the types of data that you might have. Primary data, secondary data, qualitative data, quantitative data. Okay, and then look at different things. So if we see she asked 10 people who saw the bottle thrown if they would allow her to interview them. So interviewing them is clearly going to be primary data, but we also find that it's going to be words because she's going to potentially record that interview and then transcript it. So therefore it has to be qualitative. You could have closed questions about what they had seen. This is also going to be data which is primary because she's collecting it, but the closed questions could have like a true or false situation. So when we look at the mark scheme, we find that they're actually quite open to ideas as long as you can explain yourself. So for example, primary data could be one of the answers. So you're talking about directly speaking to them, or you can talk about quantitative data because of closed data, as I said, true, false, a scale out of 10, was this a scary experience? Or qualitative data because you use words in interviews. So if you can't understand what they're asking, it's very difficult to answer this question. So don't dismiss this. Make sure that you do have a look at primary and secondary data and qualitative and quantitative data and try and understand what it is that she's looking at. Here's another one. So looking at the effectiveness of physiotherapy in the recovery of stroke patients. Explain one disadvantage of obtaining qualitative data in this study. Now, of course, that's important. It does say in this study, so therefore we need to refer to this particular study. Then it asks you to write one question that could be used to produce quantitative data and one question that can be used for qualitative data. So in other words, if you don't understand what they are, it's very difficult to answer this particular question. So we see the first bit, this tells us that maybe we need to look at some kind of disadvantage of quantitative data, for example, lacks detail. But of course, in brackets, they got there, which may decrease validity of the findings. So we can't just say lacks detail. We need to actually kind of add, well, why is this a problem? The second one says that clear application regarding the negative impact of using quantitative data, such as rating of patient's improvement. So, in other words, you need to kind of read the question, try and understand it, and have a look at that. Certainly, you can pause the video and kind of consider what you would do. At this particular stage, we also see at the bottom that they've given examples of quantitative data that could be collected and qualitative data. So they're not difficult questions, but what I would argue is that we need to try and gain maximum marks. Now that's directly in research methods type of questions, but during paper 1 and paper 2 and paper 3, they might ask you these types of questions within the context of that. So it says there, psychologists who study cognitive development sometimes collect quantitative data. So this is about cognitive development. Outline one study in which a psychologist studying cognitive development collect quantitative data. In your answer, explain how the data collection technique was quantitative. So in other words, we don't do cognitive development as a topic. It's one of our choices where we choose to do relationships. So it could be psychologists use sometimes who study relationships sometimes use quantitative data. Okay, so then you've got to go back to your course and go, okay, which studies did we have a look at? And there could be we study a person called Bus. There's people like that. So you've got to go back and say, what type of data did they collect? And then you've got to actually answer this question in context with the course that you've done. So think about what you've done in psychopathology and social so far. Are there particular studies that you feel that they have used quantitative data? and then you've got to explain, well, how it is quantitative data. And I'm hoping that you can see that this question, how, is trying to get you to see the practicalities. What was it that they did? Okay, so for example, if I was collecting quantitative data, I might say, okay, so I'm going to do a memory recall test with you, and you have to write down words. And then I'm going to take each of your responses and count how many words you got correctly. And then that count is the number that represents quantitative data. So you've got to be really careful that you can answer these types of questions. I do hope that this video makes sense. I do apologize for the coughing. Of course, it would have to happen while I'm making the video. But for now, I hope that this is something that you can use to fill out the workbook. Thank you very much, and bye.